thank you once again for coming. Please, from a show of hands, how many of y'all have ever been to one of my town halls before? Okay, so about half. Thank you. Thank you for coming again. What you're in store for today, however, is a little bit of a different experience, and that's because we are doing our State of the Six, which is once a year, only once a year, as opposed to the other town halls, which we do once a month, roughly speaking, and have a little bit of a different rhythm to it. So, welcome right now. For those of you guys who didn't notice, the exits are in the back, as well as the restrooms, much better as well. So please, if you need for any reason to leave at any point in time due to an emergency or restroom requirement, that's the direction that you'll be heading. There are also, of course, exits down here, but I would imagine that you'd do that if there were a true emergency as well. So let's go ahead and move to the agenda, please. We try to start on time. Unfortunately, I'm already 5 minutes behind, so I'll try and make up for some of that time. But this will be the agenda for today. We will be going through a pretty lengthy presentation, as we do for each of the State of the Six. It's going to take, a relatively speaking, considerable amount of time, because I really want to make sure I go through a comprehensive outline of what's been going on in Washington, D.C. and in our district over the last year. So again, this is slightly different than our normal town halls, which may be issue-focused and maybe a little bit different in format. This hopefully will be a comprehensive review for all of you. Once again, we are joined by Mayor Pete, the original, the OG Mayor Pete. He is going to be Mayor Urschler is going to be in charge of organizing your questions. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but he's already, it looks like, well at work here on that. And then we'll go ahead and head in after some questions and answers from Mayor Urschler to some closing remarks and hopefully get you guys out of here on time. Let's go to the next slide. For those of you who've been to town halls with me before, you have seen a slide like this before. This comes from my heritage and my origin story of having been an educator for a time. For those of you guys who are classroom educators, you know that there's something called classroom norms. For those of you guys who have ever run a meeting, you know that there are meeting norms as well. You shouldn't look at your cell phone, you should be present, all of those kinds of things. These are our norms for today. We are trying really hard to set these standards of behavior for our community and for each other, because I genuinely believe that all of us who are here are patriots. Every one of us who is here loves our country, our family, our community, and wants very much to see the best for our nation and for our world. And we want to make sure that we're treating each other with dignity and respect during the course of this experience together, and that we're dealing with issues rather than personalities or people. So we'll go ahead and move on from here. To that end, we do have a process whereby you should have each received at least one, and if you'd like more than one, you're welcome to raise your hand for more. Comment card or question card, please do fill those out. This is a new version of our card, so it's slightly different than ones that we've used before. Please try really hard to use legible handwriting, and also to add your questions in there in a legible format. So if for some reason we're not able to get to your question in the course of the next hour and a half, we will be following up with you. Our staff will be giving you a call. Peter is also going to be taking those questions, and I can already see piles beginning to form of similar questions, so that we make sure that we don't ask the same question 9 or 10 times, which sometimes happens when you're not running a meeting or an experience quite this way before. So let's go ahead and move on. I'm going to go ahead and start with some opening remarks to try to hopefully set the stage with you all about kind of what we're expecting over the next hour or so together. It's awesome to see so many of you all, so many familiar faces, and I've met a lot of new people as well. Yesterday we were in Coatesville and had the awesome opportunity to mark the life of Martin Luther King Jr. And a special thank you for those folks who are here in the audience who were there yesterday or who participated in any form of the National Day of Service as well. Today we are going to have a 24-slide presentation for this annual address, so settle in. If you were standing, I would tell you to bend your knees to make sure you don't pass out, so remind me occasionally to do that as well. That's a tried and true military trick to make sure you don't pass out while standing up. It really truly is the honor of my lifetime to be able to serve you all. I'm in my 5th year now. I'm a junior in Congress, so I'm relatively speaking still a little green around the ears. I'm working really hard to make sure that I serve all of our community. Our community is a complex one, and I'm confident that we may not agree on every issue, but I'm hopeful that you will see in the course of this next hour that I'm working really hard to make decisions on our behalf and to take actions on our behalf that best reflect the majority of our community. So throughout this evening, I'll be reviewing a lot of different topics, from agriculture to Veterans Affairs. We tried to get the A to Z, but we couldn't quite get the Z. But these are the range of issues that we're going to be talking about. And it's definitely my intention to make sure that we give you an update on those important issues, and that if for whatever reason that update isn't complete enough or doesn't allow enough detail, that we're able to answer questions as well on those particular topics too. That's actually part of the process of government, that sometimes things take a very long time for us to be able to accomplish them. President Obama famously once compared the country and our process or progress to steering an ocean liner. He said that sometimes it's really hard and / impossible to take a 90-degree turn, as much as we would like to in some cases, but we rather have to move forward incrementally, a few degrees here or there, to readjust our ship as we drive together, without first accidentally tossing people overboard or running aground. And so that's part of why you will see a very, hopefully, pragmatic and incremental approach from the conversation we're having tonight. I do believe, though, that we have come quite a long distance in the 5 years since I've been able to join the Congress, and hopefully you will see some of that progress. You'll certainly know that we've experienced an enormous amount of setbacks as well along the way, not to exclude things such as COVID. But we are, I think, a remarkably resilient community, one that I brag on constantly when I'm down in Washington, D.C. We are one of the very, very few what are called purple districts in the country, one of just a few dozen districts that are almost equally divided between Democrats and Republicans, and that have a really large swath of independents as well. So I think it's really a remarkable district that you all are sitting in and living in and residing in. I'm reminded of a very famous quote by Winston Churchill, who is not an American, you probably have followed along, but he is in fact a former British Prime Minister who had a lot to say about America. And specifically, he at one point said, "Success is not final, failure is not fatal, but it is the courage to continue that counts." And that, I think, sums up a lot of what's going on in our community and in our country right now. So those are our opening remarks, and with that, we have the opportunity to transition into our congressional update. Woo-hoo! Congressional offices cover a lot of different issues, issues that you may or may not be aware of. And so tonight, we mentioned that we'll be covering many of them. Our updates cannot simply be exhausted because we don't have all of the time to cover everything, but hopefully you will learn during the course of this hour a lot about a lot. And if there is a topic that you don't see enough of, as I mentioned, we will be more than happy to answer your questions when we reach out to you afterwards. We have an amazing team that I will introduce you to both here in the district, and some of them have actually journeyed from Washington, D.C. as well, that I can introduce you to. And we will also be introducing you throughout the course of the evening to a lot of local representatives and community leaders as well, who I hope that you will avail yourself of the opportunity to meet, because they are the heart and soul of our community. And I hope to have the opportunity to recognize many of them. Let's go ahead and move to the first slide, please. So I mentioned a little bit about the 6th Congressional District. You are sitting in the 6th Congressional District. This is called the Pennsylvania 6th. It's not a terribly catchy name, but we are one of 17, and we are the number 6. As a refresher, and for those who are new in the audience, the District 6 includes all of Chester County and the southern part of Berks County, including the city of Reading. And I've met a bunch of folks here in the audience who have made it from Berks and from Reading in particular. Due to a Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruling about 6 or so years ago, which overturned some gerrymandering that was going on in 2018, the Congressional District 6 changed very drastically at that point in time. And then as a result of the 2020 elections and the 2020 census, new lines were again drawn because Pennsylvania lost a congressional seat in the 2020 cycle because we had a decreasing population. So we went from having 18 members of Congress to 17, and you can see that depicted by the new district depicted by the blue arrow, where we gained some territory kind of up in the upper parts of southern Berks County. For reference, Aubrey will click. This is where we are sitting right now. The yellow stars represent where we are sitting. And from Phoenixville, which is one of the most eastern parts of our district, to Ackland, which is one of the most western parts of our district, that distance is approximately a 45-minute drive, to give you some perspective. And from Reading, which is possibly one of the furthest north parts of our district, all the way to the southernmost portion of our district, it's about an hour and 30-minute drive. So when I travel around our community, what you'll see typically is I'm in DC 3 weeks out of 4. In the 1 week that I tend to be able to be home, I will rotate around the district and spend my time concentrated in southern Chester County or in Berks County or in central Chester County on one day, and make sure that I'm focusing my time on each of those. Similarly, I move our town halls around our community as well, so you'll see town halls moving around. The State of the Six has been traditionally held here, but most of our town halls are rotated all around our community, and many of them also are available via telephone as well. Let's move to our next slide as well. We work really, really hard to make sure that we are putting you, our community members, in the center of our work. And frankly, this is why we're here. Sometimes we get a lot of phone calls to our DC office asking appropriately questions about legislative issues, and we understand that. But one of the biggest parts of our job, frankly, is to be the intersection, not just between you and the federal government in terms of legislation, but between you and any federal agency. So we encourage you, please, to reach out to make sure that we can advocate for you on any of the things that we call casework. As you can see from this pie chart, there's lots of different kinds of casework that come in all different sorts of flavors. The biggest portion of this pie is the IRS at 45%, and it's depicted in a blue. The IRS makes up, seriously, the plurality of our cases, and it's one of the bigger reasons why I support very strongly legislation to hire more staff at the IRS and to modernize their systems as well. Not receiving your tax return due to our government's inefficiency is really unacceptable. And we also help with things like the benefits that you might get if you're a veteran, as I am, or Social Security issues that you might have, or loans that you might have with the SBA. And many of us had that experience during COVID where we were availing ourselves of PPP loans. The total amount of money that we have returned to our community over 5 years is about $56 million. To give you a perspective of how much we cost the taxpayer, we cost the taxpayer every year about $1.3 million. So every year we cost $1.3 million, and over the course of 5 years, you can do the quick back of the envelope math. That's about how much we cost you guys, and we've returned $56 million of value to the community. So having been a former entrepreneur myself, I want to make sure that we are a profitable venture and worthy of the taxpayers' expenses. One of the best ways that I can connect with you guys is through meetings such as this, and town halls are something that we are committed to. We committed that we would try to hold a town hall at least once every month, and we've done that. In fact, we are the Pennsylvania's highest number of town halls held, and today marks our 82nd town hall that we have had. Our office really values as well public service, and so we do as much as we can to make sure we're encouraging the young people in our community, and I've just met a couple of them as I've walked through. Two of the best ways that we can do this is through an internship program, which is active in all 3 of our offices, both in Reading, as well as in Westchester, as well as in Washington, D.C. We have been able to provide internships for 96 young people so far, and if you're in the office and you're in the building and you're interested in something like that, I will point out our team members here and encourage you to apply for that. The second thing that I'm also incredibly proud of is the effort that we make to encourage people to apply to our military academy programs and to matriculate into those programs as well. I mentioned briefly that I'm a veteran. I'm actually a 3rd generation veteran, and I take very seriously the opportunity and privilege that we have as an office to nominate people to attend for free the 5 service academies that we have. We typically get in about 15 kids a year. And to give you some perspective on what that looks like for most offices get about 5 kids in a year. So this is something that we are enormously proud of. And so far we've been able to nominate 122 students to date. Next slide, please. So not everything that we do in our office has a monetary number associated with it. So we have some things that we do that we know make a huge difference in people's lives that may or may not come back with a dollar figure attached to them. So these are the indirect things that I'm going to be talking about next. Examples include things like passport assistance. You probably were following that this was an absolute mess when COVID kind of lifted. There were lots and lots of people who were trying to do appropriately, trying to get out of Dodge and travel and see their families, and many people had let their passports lapse or hadn't had one to begin with, and so we had a lot of pressure on our passport system to be working better than it was. We were able to do that in spades in a lot of different cases. And we have a case study here from Daria, whose story is on this slide. She was at risk actually of losing her employment because of her legal permanent resident application status had come to a standstill. So aside from passports, we can also help on these issues. And she reached out to our office for help. We were able to assist her, and she was able to thankfully retain her employment. And we're really glad that she is able to continue to stay here and contribute in our community. It's my understanding that Daria is in the audience. Should I say hey to you? Are you here? I don't see you, but if you're here, just wave your hand. If not, I'm grateful to have Daria be willing to share her story with us. Our district team works very, very hard to make sure we can resolve some of these kinds of issues. I have the privilege of being able to introduce our district team, many of whom are here tonight. If you wouldn't mind standing up or raising your hand, and I will embarrass you for just a second. Andrew, Anum, Connor, Donnell, Lizette, Sari, Scott, Sue, Tasha, and Victoria, would you please make yourselves present and known? These guys work relentlessly on hundreds and hundreds of cases on our behalf for our community, and I'm enormously grateful to them. We also have Emma and Ashley and Jack, who have driven from Washington, D.C. today to be with us as well. We have a complement of about 18 people. That is what we are legally capped at in terms of what we're allowed to hire in our office. It's divided almost equally between Washington, D.C. and here in the district, so it's roughly speaking 9 and 9. So we're joined by most of my team here tonight. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So this is something that I think is important for me to say, and I'm hoping that by the end of this presentation, for those who have not met me before, who have not seen me speak before, you will come away with a sense of who I am and who I attempt to be while in service of us. In September, the Bipartisan Policy Center recognized my work and the work of my office with a Legislative Action Award. And this award is presented to just 6 members of the Congress every year in recognition of their proven ability to work across the aisle and to produce legislation with bipartisan support while conducting themselves also in a manner that is civil and decent. And as the title suggests, this award is distributed to an equal number of Democrats and to Republicans, both across the House as well as to the Senate. I'm really proud to have been one of the 3 Democrats that were recognized this past year. I've also been recognized by the Common Ground Committee as being one of the highest scoring members of the House or Senate in their Common Ground scorecard. This is a measure of how much elected officials work across party lines to find common ground. So to date, in this 118th Congress that we are currently halfway through, 92% of the bills that I have introduced are bipartisan. 86% of the bills that I have co-sponsored or put my name behind have also been bipartisan. And I'm also considered to be one of the most bipartisan members of the House by the Lugar Center at Georgetown University. So please do know that I recognize that I serve in a very purple community. I was raised by one Democrat and one Republican who voted together every single time and canceled each other's votes out every single time. And it is my responsibility to serve all of us, and that I take very seriously. Next slide, we're talking about, this is where we're going to transition into some of these issue areas. So we've just talked a little bit about kind of what happens in constituent service and what happens with case study and now cases. And now we're going to move on into some of the titles of large pieces of work that we do, perhaps in Washington, but also as importantly down in our community as well. So the first one of that is education and workforce development. I have this thing that we call in our office a no-duh agenda. It's the stuff that we ought to be working on and we ought to just say no duh. Education and workforce development is one of those things. And we have an incredible workforce in our community because we have exceptional educational opportunities in our community. I've supported workforce development programs in a lot of different ways. One in particular is something called community funding or community project funding, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later on. But what community project funding is it's direct funding that comes directly from the federal government and includes two things that happened this past year. One was for the Reading Area Community College, which is up in Berks County, and one was for Farmer John here in Chester County. Krista Barfield is the CEO of Farmer John, and she's here tonight. And her team and she are working to diversify and innovate on farming practices across southeastern Pennsylvania. She's here with us tonight. I saw her earlier. Raise your hand, Krista. Please stand. And it's a privilege to be able to help support you and so many other really cool projects in our community. Within the past several months, we've also had the opportunity to host the Commerce Department at the Delaware Community College and discuss jobs that will be helped by the CHIPS Act, the CHIPS and Science Act. This develops this key component of our developing workforce, and that key component is making sure that we have the skills to be able to take advantage of American manufacturing that's coming back, specifically on chip manufacturing, and making sure specifically that we have a much more secure supply chain in our chip manufacturing, and that we get our reliance away from places like China, away from places like Taiwan, to make sure that we are independent and secure in our dependence on things like chip manufacturing. So we were able to host a meeting about that as well, and that's a picture of that over there. Transitioning is still about education and workforce, but just talking about the basic needs that we all have. Our office spends a lot of time also on basic literacy and numeracy and financial literacy and all the C's that you can think of, civic engagement as well. These are things that we want to make sure that our teachers are able to help educate on. We were thrilled to be able to specifically host a literacy fair and a town hall up in the Reading area with our Sesame Street friends. Up in Reading, they brought all of their cute Muppets as well. Our families and teachers were able to participate in that, and our nonprofits as well. We also are working legislatively on these issues too. I'm a former chemistry teacher and an engineer, and so I care a lot about STEM and STEAM, particularly women and girls in STEM and STEAM. But I was able to introduce a piece of legislation again this Congress that's called the Mathematical and Statistical Modeling and Education Act. It's a bipartisan piece of legislation that would help encourage our K through 12 schools to reform the way they think about math. This thankfully has passed again through the committee. So the Committee of Science and Space has passed this. Hopefully by the end of this Congress we will be able to pass this into law. And I have some hope because it is a bipartisan piece of legislation that has quite a few sponsors on it as well. We'll move to the next slide, please. We're continuing our focus on families now, and we're going to do that with the small people, the tiniest members of our family. It's our babies. Everybody I know, and every parent specifically, wants to make sure that our newborns are able to thrive. And many moms, as we probably are aware, choose the opportunity to nurse their baby. But as we've also seen through COVID and other reasons, not every mom is able to nurse their baby, and not every mom chooses that. So when I was able to visit the breast and maternity ward at Paoli Hospital in May of 2022, I was able to hear about something that I had never known about before, and that is donor breast milk. This was before the issue that we had with infant formula, but just around that time. And we recognized as a result of meeting one of the nurses at the maternity ward that there really were barriers around awareness for this particular supply. There were problems with the regulation of breast milk, and there were problems in terms of how we were able to make sure that nurses and breast milk were able to get to infants, particularly for our Black and brown communities. So because of the idea of this particular nurse in this neonatal ward, we were able to take her ideas and start working immediately on a bipartisan piece of legislation, which was also bicameral. Bicameral just means that it's on the House side and also on the Senate side. This legislation would address all of these issues of infant formula and infant milk or breast milk by creating an awareness campaign at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services that would allow a better pathway for accessibility through programs like WIC, which is the Women and Infant and Children Food Nutrition Program, and once and for all, hopefully fix the regulatory burdens that we experience for this as well as infant formula at the Food and Drug Administration. We need to do a lot more than just this idea for our families, clearly. Families also need time, and this is something that I think is really, really important. They need time with their infants. They need time with their family members when there are changes in their lives to be able to bond with their children, to be able to take care of their family members without fear of losing their job or getting behind. And once and for all, this country, one of very, very few countries that doesn't have any paid leave system, needs to make sure that we get behind this and create a paid leave system. And what's really, really cool and really, really interesting about paid leave is that this has all of a sudden become a bipartisan issue. For decades, it's sort of languished between parties. Democrats taking it this way, Republicans taking it that way. But for the first time ever, there is now a bipartisan paid family leave working group that I am leading along with Representative Stephanie Bice of Oklahoma to work on the legislative framework that would allow us to solve for more paid leave for more people. And I'll go over a few of the ideas of this paid leave legislation. We just introduced our framework last week or 2 weeks ago, and if you'd like to, I'll go over these real quickly with you. The first thing is to support employers by offering paid leave programs, including an expansion of an already existing tax credit, known as the 45S tax credit, which is set to expire if we don't do something about it shortly. The second idea is to unify across states the best practices. There are now 14 states that have already implemented paid leave, and one of the reasons why there's so much energy federally behind this is we don't want 50 states with 50 different solutions. We want to make sure that there's at least one baseline solution, and we're harmonizing across the states that have already done it and working with best practices as well. We're giving small businesses, of which many of the people here in the audience, and I was as well, are the heart of the economy. We're giving small businesses tools to be able to provide paid leave for their employees as well through pooling of private insurance possibly. And we're also funding the administration of state paid leave to make sure that there is the ability for states that don't yet have this program to prime the pump and be able to start having paid leave. So importantly, this is the very first time, as I mentioned, that bipartisan and bicameral, there's a similar group on the Senate side, also Democrats and Republicans, who are leading this effort. And we're hoping that we're going to be able, even in this very divided time, to move forward on paid leave, even hopefully within this year as well. And so that's something that's very exciting on the health and wellness of families. Let's move to the next slide. I'm trying to figure out where I should be being in terms of time. Am I a little bit? A little behind. I'll move faster. Okay, the next slide is on safety. Another agenda. Of course, we should care about this. Our families clearly care about safety, their own safety, and of course the safety of their loved ones as well. During the 117th Congress, so the Congress that ended a year or so ago, there was legislation that we talked about last State of the Union that was the first of its kind and the first in 28 years that talked about bipartisan safer communities and talked about this landmark legislation focused on health, mental health issues, as well as expanding background checks, as well as broadening the scope for existing restrictions on how people access guns. And this legislation, I am happy to report, is working. And let me get through some of the details there. The law was passed, as I mentioned, in last Congress in 2022. We've had an opportunity to implement that law and to begin collecting data on that. Law enforcement departments across our country have been tracking these measures, and by and large, they have contributed and concluded that in 2023, and I'm quoting their report, there has been a drop in homicides and other violent crimes, and that this drop can be attributed to expanded efforts to prevent crime, including working with community volunteers, including targeting gun possessions in high crime areas and placing officers on foot and on bike patrols. So according to this particular report, Jeff Asher is the co-founder of something called Age Data Analytics. I always want to make sure I source things so that I make sure you guys know where my data is coming from. There has been a 13% decrease in violent crimes, and it's the largest one in 1 year in history. And this is nationwide. This is rural, this is suburban, this is small towns, and this is large cities as well. And so I believe that our 28-year piece of legislation should not be once every 28 years, but I believe it has made a difference in the safety and security of our communities. And just last week, Vice President Harris also announced an additional $285 million from the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act that will place, once again, mental health counselors and social workers in schools to make sure that they can help our kids with those issues as well. I'm a parent. I'm a mom, obviously, and I'm also a human being. I know, because I watch the news too, that there's a lot going on in our communities. And I know, because I watch the news too and I'm a parent, that we have a lot more work to do. But we are working really hard on this particular issue, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to hopefully continue to legislate on making our communities and schools safer places. Next slide, please. Okay, we're transitioning from families and safety to the economy. Many of you in the audience asked me questions about this, so hopefully this will give you some good data and good answer on what's going on in the economy. This is again a NODA agenda, kitchen table issues. We know, I'm a mom, I'm a spouse to a super cute guy who's sitting over here. Whether you have kids to care for, whether you are on a fixed income, whether you're still working to pay for your own education, I know that expenses are something that you care deeply about, because I do too. When I go into Wawa, I know how expensive things are, and I walk out feeling a little less wealthy. And in my perception, which is very much like yours, the prices for consumer goods, the things that we buy every day, are still too high. I'm a member of something that's called the New Democrat Coalition. And this is the group, the largest group in Congress you probably have never heard of. We're more than 100 members strong of Democrats that caucus or group around the issue of the economy to make sure that we're creating a powerful and strong capitalistic economy for everyone. And as one of the founders of an inflation working group within the New Democratic Coalition, earlier this year I was able to unveil a new report that talks about inflation and about our action report, which you can read by scanning a QR code. For those of you guys who came in with and got a handout, there are 2 QR codes on your handouts. One of them will give you this report so that you're able to see what the report is and how I am trying to address this issue of inflation in our economy. And I was able also to join Fox News to talk about this issue as well, the progress that we've made on the road and the road ahead as well. Let's do some data comparing year to year. Last year, our local economy has taken some good steps in the right direction. So here are some of them. According to the AAA, the average price of a gallon of gasoline in our community is now $3.37 a gallon. Last year at this time it was $3.66 a gallon. And in June of last year, the price of a gallon of gas was $5.01 a gallon. So we are making progress, albeit I will agree with you, not quickly enough. Energy companies, let's talk about that in Pennsylvania, because we're experiencing something slightly different than people in other states are experiencing in terms of the cost of our energy. PECO and PPL have reduced their rates by approximately 7 to 9% per kilowatt hour very recently. And natural gas rates for PECO and UGI utilities have actually also decreased by 28 to 41% respectively. And this will of course reduce our household bills and will particularly help those who are struggling with this issue during winter months as well. Some of you may have noticed that we did a town hall on this very issue, specifically on access to light heat, to make sure that everybody could afford to heat their homes. To add to these figures, the Biden administration also will shortly release guidance on something called the Inflation Reduction Act, which we'll go over briefly in another couple of slides or so, which includes a ton of tax rebates and incentives for consumers and residences to be able to use to reduce further their costs of energy. Energy costs are driving pricing for a lot of other goods as well. So you know that if it costs more to run your factory floor, you're going to pass that cost possibly on to your consumers. And we know that it impacts how communities are spending their tax dollars on things like powering your local fire department as well. So when we spend less on energy, which we hope through the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the other things that are going on in our economy, our overall household costs will also fall as well. So let's move to the next slide, which again is a slide on our economy and a very dynamic picture. I spend a lot of time reading monthly reports, and there are reports on our unemployment rates, or there are reports on the stock market. It is very much of a moving picture. Our economy is definitely more than just the price of a gallon of gas. It's a lot of other factors as well. So they include things like wage growth and, as I mentioned, unemployment rates. And here's some more good news to take home as well. More and more economists are predicting what is called a soft landing. Fewer and fewer economists are predicting what has been warned of, which is a recession. And more they're predicting a soft landing because supply chains that have been impacted by the pandemic and also by, of course, Ukraine and other stressors to our global economy are on the wane. That doesn't mean that they're getting completely better, it just means they're getting better than they have been, and that's in the right direction. Those economists include our very own Dr. Mark Zandi, who's the chief economist of Moody's Analytics, and he also happens to be a constituent here in the 6th Congressional District. Important for our community in Chester County, where we're sitting right now, our unemployment rate is 2.8%. Talking about, because it's a stunning, historically low level. Berks County's unemployment level, 3.7%. Across the Commonwealth, our overall unemployment rate is 3.7%. Along these lines, I'd like to emphasize something that's on the screen right now. The unemployment rate has now remained below 4% for 25 months, a stretch last accomplished in 1960s. The average hourly wage growth accelerated slightly in December, continuing to outpace inflation, boosting worker spending power, especially amongst our lowest earners. Similar to these positive trends in Congress, we have to make sure that we keep our eye on the ball and keep working. I know, because I shop, I eat out as well. I know that we still have a ton of work to do. Food costs is particularly are uncomfortably high. But the supply chains themselves, disruptions have been ameliorated. They are heading in the right direction. Most retailers, if you watch the news this holiday season, experienced really decent business over the course of the holiday buying season, and that's good news. Again, without a doubt, tons of work to still do, but heading in the right direction. Next slide, please. So now we're going to hone in on our region. What's happening here in Pennsylvania's 6th Congressional District? A lot of really good stuff is happening here. In fact, I believe that Chester County is one of only 2 counties in Pennsylvania that's growing in population, which is pretty cool. Some of the things that are causing that, some of the jobs that are bringing that success here, I'm going to highlight right now. This has been particularly notable in the manufacturing sector. Recently, I had the opportunity to visit a company called International Paper and their new facility in Ackland. If you've never thought about how cardboard boxes are made, I would encourage you to go visit them. I also had an opportunity to get a preview of World Titus Recycling in the Recycle the World in Birdsboro as well, and we'll shortly have the chance to be able to participate in the ribbon cutting as well in the weeks to come there. Their facility produces energy, removes waste, and helps to secure our energy grid in southeastern Pennsylvania and beyond. And I'm really grateful to have both Mark Finley, Project Director, and Joe DeCenjo, Chairman, and others from World Titus here in the audience. Would you please let yourselves be known as well? $100 million investment is coming to Berks County through these guys. Thank you very much for participating. Next slide. But wait, there's more. More jobs, more jobs. People are definitely the core of our business sector, and so when businesses succeed in our area, of course, Pennsylvanians and Chester County and Berks County residents succeed as well. This fall, I also had the opportunity to visit Leopoldo Sanchez in his newest store, the Supernatural Produce store in Reading. It's under construction now with local workers, and once it is built, it will employ so many members from our community, and it will be able to provide access to healthy foods in what has until now been a food desert. Because of the community benefits for his store, he was able to qualify for a federal grant from the American Rescue Plan Act that will assist him in this new venture. Importantly, whenever you read in the paper something called ARPA or American Rescue Plan, think federal dollars. That's where that money came from, and we've been the beneficiary of a ton of the ARPA money recently. As many of you also know, in Coatesville, another city in our area, we recently lost a storied manufacturer a few years ago. And I couldn't be happier to share with you again that the Piasecki Aircraft Corporation held their official ribbon cutting ceremony in May, and the Heliplex is now open and thriving once again. So their plan is to employ 400 people at the Piasecki Heliplex, everyone from painters to engineers. So if you're interested in cutting edge and innovative job opportunity, please contact them. So Leopoldo Sanchez and John Piasecki and many members of his team are also here with us tonight. If you wouldn't raise your hand or stand up and make yourselves known as well. Thank you for bringing such awesomeness to our community. The innovative is not just about stuff in the air, it's about the right stuff in the air with the right technologies, doing the right thing for our planet. So thank you for doing that. Next slide. How am I doing for time?
Still behind you.
How many? 5 minutes behind. Okay. Sorry, guys. I'll keep working on it. The next question, the next presentation or part of the presentation, we'll talk about infrastructure. It's really hard to have good jobs. It's really hard to have a nice place to live if you can't get from there A to B. If you can't get from your home to your job, that's not very useful. We struggle with that, particularly in our area. So infrastructure is very, very important. And importantly, some of the bigger things that we did last Congress, in the 117th Congress, is something called the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also referred to sometimes as IIJA. And for those of you who've been in our office and received our emails, we've been talking about this particular issue a lot because this is a generational, possibly once every 2 generations, investment in our infrastructure. And it's really, really overdue, and Pennsylvania is getting a huge part of it. So this law will expand and revitalize things like our roads and our bridges, our broadband, make our drinking water safe, making our floodwaters hopefully less acute. I know that recently in Phoenixville we experienced more flooding this week. And since we're standing here in Phoenixville, you also probably know that there will now be a rail line once again. And the historic city of Reading will also be connected. And this is really important for you guys to hear. That is because of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Thank you. And it's also really important for you to hear when you go home tonight as your homework. Go ahead and take a look at how that was voted on in the House. I'm giving you that as assignment. Nearly 280,000 homes as well in Pennsylvania do not currently have high-speed internet, but this Infrastructure and Jobs Act will also expand our broadband infrastructure to libraries, to schools, to municipal buildings, to people's homes, to rural areas and urban areas, to places that don't have connectivity. We only had to see what happened with COVID to understand what the importance of and the equity is that's involved with having access to broadband. This law will also help with floodwater. Floodwaters are real, as we've experienced here in Phoenixville or in Medina or in all of Chester County, as you know. Districts like Antietam and Berks County have also experienced some pretty awful flooding. Communities like Downingtown, Pocopson, all of those places were devastated, as we know, by Hurricane Ida. We really need to invest in flood mitigation and making sure that we are building for resiliency as well. Federal money is coming our way to help with stormwater mitigation, and it's not just in one bill. There's also money that has come to us through the American Rescue Plan. Again, anytime you hear ARPA, think federal funding. And those funds were given to the Brandywine Conservancy as an example to help fund a study to improve resiliency around the watershed communities that we all know and love. Grant DaCosta from the Brandywine Conservancy is also here this evening, if you wouldn't mind letting us know where you are. Next. But wait, there's more. Jobs, jobs, jobs. We're still talking about infrastructure and investment. The Pennsylvania Department of Transportation, commonly known as PennDOT, also maintains a lot of highways in our community, 41,000 miles to be specific. And we have 25,400 state-owned bridges, and that's the third largest in the country. And that's important because the Infrastructure and Jobs Act comes with money and formulas based on how many of these kinds of things we have. And because we have so many of these kinds of things, we get a lot of money. Again, I would encourage you to go home and take a look at who voted for the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, because this is really important. We are going to be able to get $13 billion from the Infrastructure and Jobs Act to repair bridges over the next 5 years. And this is very important work that, of course, will revitalize the roads of our area, the schools that depend on those roads, people getting to work, to worship, for recreation, any sort of export products that need to travel on those roads. We are really, really excited to be able to make this happen. But these aren't nameless and faceless people who do the work that we're talking about. While they weren't able to attend tonight, I'm really very proud to be able to recognize a local company that actually benefits from many of these contracts for the $13 billion that are heading our way. That company is in Akron, and the company is J.D. Eckman, and I commend them very much for their decades of skilled work and their quality engineering and their family-owned business. They are a third-generation family business located right here in our district that will be bringing jobs, jobs, jobs to our community because of the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. Next, and we're getting there, guys. I guess we have like about 8 more slides to go, so hang in there before your questions. Reminder to please get your questions down on paper so that we can answer them. It looks like we've got stacks and stacks of them. Next slide, lowering energy costs and protecting the environment. I know a lot of us here in Chester County and Berks County really value the environment. It's a beautiful place to live. It's also one of the things that's, interestingly enough, very, very bipartisan in our community, is our love for the planet and our love for all things open space. So we can't talk about infrastructure without recognizing its correlation to energy and to energy consumption and to its impact on the environment. I'm also really proud to be the co-chair of the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus. And I'll take a second, and I know I'm running behind, but this is important. There was no Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus until a couple of years ago when I was able to join it, and now I'm able to lead it as the Democrat that leads that. I am thankful. I'm proud to say that there are more than 60 members of Congress who are now part of that Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus, and they join equally. It's called the Noah's Ark Caucus. Democrat and Republican come together, and there are more than 60 of us in that caucus right now. We recognize as a group that the climate change problem is real and that humans cause it, but we also recognize as a group that we cannot make success or be successful if we don't work together for durable, meaningful, bipartisan solutions that don't get changed depending on who's in the White House. So that's what we've been working on. And as part of the IIJA, our southeastern Pennsylvania region was awarded one of 7 hydrogen hubs in the country. So this is the Mid-Atlantic Clean Hydrogen Hub. It's also called MACH2. And this is going to help us with decarbonization, hydrogen-driven decarbonization. I know that this is a controversial topic to some in our community and to some probably in this audience, but there isn't a scenario that exists where we're going to be able to level the amount of climate change and to reduce the amount of temperature that our climate is experiencing, increasing, without decarbonization as part of that solution. I'm happy to share a little bit more with you all at a later time on this, but it's really, really good news that Pennsylvania is getting one of these hydrogen hubs. Indeed, we're getting 2 of them. Ours is a pink and green one. We'll talk about that later. I'm also really excited that we were able to pass another piece of legislation, inaptly named the Inflation Reduction Act, because the Inflation Reduction Act, again, I encourage you to go home and see who voted for that. The Inflation Adjustment or Reduction Act is actually really a big climate bill as well. Yeah. Over $20 billion in that bill specifically is being given for farmers and ranchers in particular, to give them the tools that they need to make sure that we are creating a more sustainable environment. $14 billion as well to lower the cost for families to be able to support good, clean-paying electric jobs for rural communities as well, and $5 billion to be able to protect our communities from things like wildfire. So the Inflation Reduction Act is another really important piece of legislation that addresses this issue of lowering energy costs and being more responsible to our planet, as well as by being more independent from other countries for our energy requirements. Let's move on. I'm supposed to now be at... Okay, let's move on. Prescription drugs, healthcare. Here we are talking about the Inflation Reduction Act. I told you that I thought it was a stupidly named bill. I will tell it like I see it. The Inflation Reduction Act did actually reduce inflation. I can explain that to you. But actually, more importantly, as I mentioned, it is a piece of legislation that talks about energy independence, but also helps us with the cost of prescription drugs. Here is an example of that reduction in cost. A headline from just today's Wall Street Journal that talks about how Medicare patients on pricey drugs are now being able to save big this year. That's because of the Inflation Reduction Act. The prescription drug costs are going to be reduced. In many cases, some have already, specifically insulin, because of the Inflation Reduction Act. It will also cap out-of-pocket expenses for Medicare Part D, making Part D benefit design changes beginning in 2024. I'm going to move a little bit more quickly because we are running close on time. Next thing that I'll highlight, we got a hydrogen hub, but we also got something called a Healthcare Innovation Tech Center. And this is something that's a big deal too, that's coming soon to a theater near you. I will move quickly through this because we are running short on time, but we are working hard to make sure that we're bringing innovation and jobs to healthcare industry as well as to the energy and environment sector. Moving along. Speaking of expanding healthcare, this is also a big deal. Many of you in the audience, particularly those of you from southern Chester County, know that we lost 2 hospitals over the course of the last couple of years. In that particular area, that's caused an acute stressor on the ER and also on inpatient services. It's also stressed out our services here in this part of the county as well. I'm really pleased to say that because of something called the PACT Act, a bipartisan piece of legislation that helps our veterans who have been exposed to toxins, because of a very small clause in the PACT Act, we are the first in the country to be trying out an experiment of working with the nonprofit educational sector, Penn Medicine, and with for-profit sector, the hospital, the VA, to combine Penn Medicine and the VA to be able to provide care for our veterans as well. This is not at the expense of anybody's jobs, no union jobs will be lost or anything, but this is a combination of public-private partnership because of the PACT Act, which will help bring better And the last couple few slides, which deserve a lot more time, and I'm going to try and give it the time they need. Strengthening our national security. Caring for veterans, as we mentioned in the last slide, is really important and a huge priority. I'm a member, though, as well of the Armed Services Committee, as well as the Intelligence Committee, which is a special select committee on kind of all of the spooky things that go on in our government. As part of those responsibilities of being part of the Armed Services Committee and the Intel Committee, it's my privilege to pass something that's called the NDAA, or the National Defense Authorization Act. Every year, without fail, for the last 60-so years, this is one of the few pieces of legislation that actually makes it all the way through, and this year is no exception. Some of the things that I was able to do of the 3 dozen or so in this bill is expanding paid leave for many of our veterans and federal employees. I was able to pass a piece of legislation that's called the Disrupt Fentanyl Trafficking Act of 2023, which requires the development of a strategy to target, disrupt, and degrade the threats to our national security that are caused or exacerbated by fentanyl trafficking. So that's a piece of legislation that I was able to get into. As well as expanding cyber scholarships for the intelligence community. We struggle very mightily to make sure that we have enough cyber capable and qualified people, and that's one of the other things that was most significant in the NDAA. I won't short shrift this next slide, because another thing that's really important to me is supporting our first responders. On the topic of security, we couldn't have a conversation if we didn't talk about the very people who are standing here in this room, who help us every day and who guard our security every day. So I'd like to make sure that I pause for a moment of appreciation for Chief Marshall and for the Phoenixville Police Department, who once again are here. And I'd also like to thank our new Chester County Sheriff, Kevin Dykes, who I think is in the audience today, though I don't remember seeing him. No? Congratulations, Sheriff, as well. And additionally, thank our fire departments and our EMT groups who are working tirelessly as well. I mentioned my brother at the beginning of this. I know the hard hours that you guys are all working. Last couple of slides. I want to make sure that you understand that our office is organized from here to Washington, not the other way around. We drive ideas from Washington, D.C., from here to Washington, D.C., and a couple of them are on this slide here. One is, in one of our town halls, I was greeted by a gentleman who was very angry, appropriately, that we were selling our Strategic Petroleum Reserve to China. And I thought, you've got a point. And so we created a piece of legislation, a bipartisan piece of legislation, to stop that practice from happening. Proud to say that it's now passed the House of Representatives, even in this very divided time, 3 different times. But if you remember your Schoolhouse Rock, it needs to actually also pass the Senate, and it needs to be agreed upon by both the House and the Senate. So it has now passed the House 3 times, the Senate 1 time, and for whatever reason that is unexplainable to me, it has fallen out of the legislation in the NDAA where it was housed. So it is not currently law, but I will continue to work on that particular piece of legislation, an idea given to me by one of the members of our community. Another piece of legislation was actually as a result of a tragedy. You all might remember that R.M. Palmer Candy Factory had a tragic accident where 7 members of our community died. There was a particular cause that was identified there, which was the presence of something called Allyl-A in some of the pipelines. There is now a bipartisan piece of legislation that we have introduced with our congressman, our fellow congressman, Dan Neuser, who has joined me in that effort to try to rid pipelines of Allyl-A as a consequence of that unfortunate event here in our community. I hope we are. And finally, circling back to Phoenixville and our police force here, on my ride-along with the police force here in Phoenixville, I learned that they were lucky enough to get a bunch of cameras for their body armor, but unlucky enough to not have enough money to be able to process all the data that is collected as a result of that. And so realized that we really need to make sure that we're funding our smallest of police departments to make sure that they can hold and store all of the data. So as a consequence of that ride-along, was able to get another bipartisan piece of legislation introduced and actually put forward into the rule. So it was ready to be voted on the floor. We'll talk a bit about the dysfunction in Congress. The rule did not pass, so it never got a vote on the floor. So hopefully we will continue to pursue that as well. But these are some ideas that come from us, come from you guys, and go to Washington to hopefully find their time in the sun. And lastly, we will talk about the final 2 things. Conflicts abroad, and also the final thing, which is the state of, the floor down in Washington. Final 2 things, and then we'll move on to questions, so please make sure you have your questions in. As I mentioned, I serve on 2 committees, the Armed Services Committee and the Permanent Select Committee as well. I take very seriously my role on intelligence and on armed services. When I joined Congress, it was before, as you recall, COVID, and before Ukraine, and before Israel, and before Taiwan, and before all of these things. And if you had asked any member of our community, they would never have asked me a question about the world. That has changed. Now people ask me questions about our role in the world all the time. Work really hard, and one of the members of our audience asked me to make sure that we're talking about Ukraine. My father was born in Lviv. I am very personally attached to Ukraine, and I very personally attached to the fact that Putin needs to be stopped for lots and lots of different reasons. And I think that we recognize that. Unfortunately, we need to work collectively to be able to pass legislation, to be able to continue to fund and support Ukraine. I am working on that. I'm working bipartisanly as well with Representative Kinzinger to make sure that we are training up Ukrainians on the use of some of our weaponry, including aircraft, and I will continue to work on those kinds of things too. Now we're going to transition to Israel because Ukraine is very much related to Israel. And I'll pause here for a minute to catch my breath to make sure that I do it the justice that it deserves as well. Israel was attacked. It was a vicious terrorist attack by Hamas, a terrorist organization. I believe that we should support Israel in their quest to protect their citizenry and their request and their need to protect their sovereignty. I am an original co-sponsor of many, many pieces of legislation condemning Hamas, condemning their use of rape and sexual violence, and supporting Israel. That being said, I am deeply alarmed by the civilian rate of casualties as well. And I am working really hard to make sure that I can balance both of those needs and feelings and requirements. And so on the right-hand side of the screen, you will see the many letters that I have written with regards to making sure that we are protecting the Palestinians. One of them is December 5th. I appreciate, sir, I appreciate your time here, and we will get to your questions. QR codes, you will be able to see the several letters that I have written along with my colleagues regarding the loss of life of the Palestinian people. I am grateful to say that as a result of some of these letters that we are writing, that the response has been a change in strategy on the part of Israel. Is that enough? I don't know. I'll continue to monitor this, and I'll continue to pressure both Israel as well as our own government and our own administration to do what we need to do to make sure we're doing all of these things, that we're protecting Israel and supporting Israel, but also protecting the lives of the innocent who are in harm's way there. As I said recently, thank you. The mounting civilian death toll is unacceptable to that gentleman's point. And I encourage the government, our government, to use every leverage that we possibly can to have a significant shift in the military strategy and tactics that are in Gaza. And you will find this information in several of the letters that are up here on the screen. It's very, very important, however, that all the work that we do works to an enduring and lasting peace in the region. As a mom and a human being, I absolutely share the concerns and the worries of many of you here of the innocent lives that are lost, both Israeli as well as Palestinian. I understand as a veteran that war is literally, genuinely hell. And that's why I hope that I am genuinely doing everything I can in committees and behind the scenes as well, and in Congress to make sure that whatever happens here, that it ensures an enduring and lasting peace. Next slide, please. Speaking of Lviv, and speaking of my father, and speaking of national security, we cannot have this conversation fairly without talking about the state of the southern border as well. The reason why I'm showing you this picture here is a picture of my father and his mom right around the time that they came here to the United States. They survived the Holocaust. They came here as a family unit. You are looking at the family that came here. So I am deeply passionate about the promise that that America provides all of us. My dad ended up serving a full career as a naval aviator, flying P-3s. I believe in our American dream and the promise. I also believe that our immigration policies have to align with the values of our country. It's a country built on immigrants, and we have to do so by protecting our sovereignty in addition to protecting those who seek asylum. So here are some issues that I think it's important. Again, I know I'm running behind, but really important that I go slowly on these issues. So let's go ahead and dig into the border. More than a decade before I even considered running for Congress, there were two major bipartisan bills that had passed the Senate by wide margins in 2006 and in 2013. Both times those bills were not taken up by the House. Since I have joined Congress, I've largely been able to address concerns at the border through the federal budget and the federal budget alone. There has been no successful bipartisan legislation at all over the course of 5 years that I've been there, which would have addressed this issue through anything other than the budget itself. So happy to talk to you about the increases in budget that I have voted for to make sure that we're protecting ourselves at the border. Again, not enough, but important. While funding and resources are important, it doesn't change the fact that we need to make sure that we are addressing the reality that we're seeing at the southern border today. And let's change the visual for a second. There are two competing bills in Congress right now. Two competing bills in Congress right now. One that's called the H.R. 2 and one that's called the Dignity Act. And I'm in support of the Dignity Act. The Dignity Act is a bipartisan piece of legislation that would help make sure that we're addressing not just the issue of asylum seeking and people coming to our border, but also the issue of who's already here and how we treat them with dignity and humanity as well. And I want to make sure that I go over briefly some of the positives of the Dignity Act, because this is the bill I believe needs to pass. The Dignity Act provides more money for CBP, or Border Patrol, and border infrastructure. It provides and mandates employers that verify immigration status of their workers. It provides a path to citizenship for our dreamers. It provides and establishes a path for permanent residency status for eligible individuals without unlawful immigration status who are meeting certain requirements, like paying into a fund to provide training for U.S. workers. On border security, the Dignity Act and H.R. 2 could not be different. And this is why I need you to hear this, because we're being asked to support H.R. 2 in some of the larger packages that we are looking at that fund Ukraine, that fund Israel, that fund humanitarian efforts. And I will not support H.R. 2. H.R. 2 removes the requirement at DHS that they transfer children to the custody of HHS within 72 hours. Under H.R. 2, this bill would require the Department of Homeland Security to be able to maintain custody for up to a month, which I don't think is adequate and appropriate for children. H.R. 2 will eliminate the requirement of a bilateral or multilateral agreement for the removal of an individual to a safe third country. This would mean that the United States could send deportees to countries that have not necessarily agreed to take these people without the assurance of a safe or viable pathway. And H.R. 2 would limit and potentially eliminate federal partnerships. And this is really important for us here in our community. This would potentially eliminate federal partnerships with non-governmental or charitable organizations. So when I was able to travel to the border, I was able to meet with a lot of nonprofits there. Many of them were from the Catholic Church. These organizations would no longer be able to partner with the Border Patrol under H.R. 2. And I think that's an example of dumbness. I think that we need to make sure that we're working together. So the bottom line is this: Congress has tried, and we have failed. We have failed to legislate here. But I really believe that we have the opportunity to work across the aisle here. I'm part of a bipartisan task force to combat Mexican drug cartels. I'm part of a bipartisan task force that's working on these particular issues in general through the Problem Solvers. I'm working really hard to address these issues. I really believe there's a there. I believe there's a middle there. We need to have the permission of our leadership on both sides of the aisle to be able to pass bipartisan, lasting, and durable legislation that will help us at the border, but will also help us maintain our standards as Americans. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and skip the next slide. And I'm going to go to slide 30 if it's okay with you, because this bears conversation, which is our final slide. Slide 30 is a picture, and picture says 1,000 words. Depending on your perspective, what's happening in Washington? You can either think there's a lot happening in Washington if you're watching your Twitter feed and you're watching just a few members of Congress, or you can think there's nothing happening in Washington. And both have some amount of truth to them. But to provide more context for you for the nothing's happening in Washington argument, in 2023, the year we just left, The Republican-led House passed only 27 bills that became law, despite us voting 724 times. I voted 42 times to reduce the salary of members of our administration and members of the federal government to $1. 42 times I was asked to spend the time of the American taxpayers to vote on a signature statement bill. And this is just an example of the dumbness that's going on in Washington, D.C. Just last week, votes were canceled yet again. Tonight, votes thankfully were canceled because of weather. But I'm not clear when I go back to Washington tomorrow at 5 in the morning that I will be voting on anything of substance. Not only was 2023 ineffective for legislation, it was also incredibly ineffective, and I'm sorry to tell it to you straight. Days and weeks were wasted while I remained in Washington, D.C. after one failed vote for speaker after another, after one dumb vote over paying somebody $1 after another. I have taken more votes on whether or not to censure members of Congress in the House of Representatives this session than any other since 1870. And I have seen at least a dozen times whether or not to reduce salaries of cabinet secretaries to $1. So make no mistake, these are super unserious votes, and they're grandstanding at the highest level. It's insulting to you all as my constituents that I'm not able to do my work. It's really, really insulting to you all as constituents, as an example, that I had planned not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times to go down to the border with a bipartisan trip to learn more about what's going on there, and had it canceled not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times because I was held in Washington for votes. And I think that this is something that's an embarrassment, and I think it's important that you all hear this. I take it very, very seriously, my responsibility in Washington. I hope very much that this does not remain the gridlock that we saw in the last year. I hope very much to make sure that we can accomplish many of the things like paid leave and border reform, all of those kinds of things that you deserve. It's my privilege to serve you. It's my privilege to turn us over to questions. I recognize I am grossly behind in schedule, and I appreciate the opportunity to now answer some of your questions.
So much, Congresswoman. And we do have, as you did state, and I won't certainly read all of these questions, but I just want to acknowledge for the audience that, and for those of you who are in the audience, please note if we are not answering your question directly, that doesn't mean that it will not be answered. These will be given to our Congresswoman's staff, and they will reach out to you personally. But Congresswoman, I do want to recognize that you have a significant number of questions, comments, and concerns specifically as you address civilian casualties in the Middle East. I do think we have one that really kind of went off of that, but here in the U.S., what can be done? In the past 100 days, we've seen a surge of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and anti-Muslim hatred in the United States. What can be done to stem this hateful tide?
No, I really appreciate the comment, and I'm really grateful for those folks who have expressed a concern for all of the loss of life that we have seen both in Israel as well as in Gaza, as well as in the West Bank, frankly, too. Please do know that I take these very, very seriously, and I appreciate your feedback on this. In terms of what to do here, I'm really grateful to say that here in our district, the 6th Congressional District, we have really worked hard to kind of hold it together with each other. We have really worked hard to hold the Muslim and Jewish faith leaders have worked as hard as they can to continue to have dialogue with one another, as well as, of course, our Christian community too. That is not what I'm seeing in other districts, even in Pennsylvania. It's not what I'm seeing in other communities in the country. And so it's really important that we lead by example. That I'm grateful that the person who asked this question asked it very even-handedly. Islamophobia is real. Anti-Semitism is real. It's really scary. It hurts all of us. It's horrifying and wrong everywhere. And so I think it's important that we hold each other together and that we lead by example and serve each other with civility and decency and call it out and talk about it and work together. And I wish that I could say that that was no dub, but it's actually not. We're seeing a lot of people who are being driven apart, full communities who are driven apart from having these conversations with one another. So let's keep it up, Chester County and Berks County, and keep talking to each other.
Thank you so much. In also the same space, there have been some questions around concerns around military spending and specifically the threat of nuclear war.
I worry about that too. In the military, my job was designing command and control systems for military attack, nuclear attack specifically. And I know, that we live in a world, a very dangerous world with a lot of people who have a lot of nuclear weapons. And I know that that's only increasing in its threat, specifically in China. And so I think it's very important that we are smart about where our military budget is spent and that we think hard about what the threat actually looks like. I don't think that necessarily always looks like sort of traditional, conventional threats or sometimes even nuclear threats, but rather maybe cybersecurity, as we've seen bio threats, those kinds of things. And so I question both of my committees, making sure that we are being as resourceful and thoughtful about where we're putting our defense resources. But I'm pretty unapologetic about the fact that we need to be supportive of our military and supportive of our defense budget, recognizing that there are many of you in this community, in our community, who don't hold those values. I appreciate that, but I also really think it's important that we lead with our deterrence. So I will continue to make sure that our men and women in uniform are well funded and that they also have the equipment that makes sense for them to have and that's responsive to the threats of today. I didn't include artificial intelligence in there as well.
Thank you. And I just want to mention that there were also a number of comments about aid to the Ukraine and the speed at which it was getting there.
Here's what I need your help on. I really worry that we're not moving fast enough on the supplemental, which is the piece of legislation that we passed, which would have Ukraine funding, Israel funding, humanitarian funding, border funding. I am supportive of the supplemental having all of those things in it. I am worried that we're being sort of culled from each other and that the strategy, depending on what side you're on, so to speak, is to fund just the border or just Ukraine or just Israel. I feel like that they're inextricably tied to one another, and so the favor I need from you is if you agree with me, call your senators. You don't need to call me. This is where I am on this. If you don't agree with me, call me. But every once in a while, call me when you agree with me. It would be helpful. It would make me feel better sometimes.
We have some questions pertaining to tax relief for seniors, specifically school taxes.
So, as much as I'd like to say, hi, if you were the one who asked that question, as much as I'd like to say that I could help you with that, that's a state issue. But I can help you with other parts of your budget. And that is things like your expenses for Medicare Part D, or things like your expenses for prescription drugs, or things like your expenses for heating your home. Those are things I can help with. And so I can also help by communicating this to any of a number of state representatives who are maybe even in this audience, to let them know that this is important to you too. I do know that we are very proud in Pennsylvania, and particularly in this area. We have a very large retired community and take good care, I think, of our retired community, but we're not perfect at it. So I will take that as a message point to bring back to our state representatives.
Thank you so much. And we do also have some questions regarding affordable housing and the affordable housing crisis in Chester County.
This is a big issue, and this can be helped with federal dollars, specifically a couple of different ways. Some is with the community project funding, which I mentioned earlier. This is a program where you guys submit ideas to our office. Last year we got about 40 or so ideas. We were able to submit 15 or so to the Appropriations Committee. We were able to get, I think, 14 of them funded. But these are the old school earmark, right? This is something where it's a direct amount of money that goes directly for a specific project, and sometimes specific housing can be addressed there. Another way, however, that it has been addressed in our area is through the American Rescue Plan. I was able to visit housing that was being built yesterday in Coatesville for veterans, actually, homeless veterans, that was using ARPA money, or the American Rescue Plan money, to be able to create more affordable housing for those who are homeless. Just as importantly, however, the Infrastructure and Jobs Act also has some resources in it, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act, to try to get people to be able to build out their homes to be more cost effective in terms of heating them, in terms of the energy that's provided for them, to have their vehicles, perhaps more affordable as well, so their transportation costs are lesser, or to be able to take the train from here to Reading as an example, so there's that money, and I'm missing one. And finally, making sure that we're placing transportation proximate to affordable housing too, so that we're reducing people's commute and we're creating a lifestyle that is not quite as dependent on driving around or moving around in our community. These are big issues in our community because this is a very attractive place to live, where we're sitting, but it's also a very, very expensive place to live. And when we're talking about affordable housing, we're not just talking about homeless veterans, we're talking about all of us. We want to make sure that anybody who works in our community is able to live in our community, and that doesn't go with saying it's not a given. People are having to, we have, I visited one factory that's making truck chassis that has hundreds of jobs available, but they can't figure out how to get people from the Coatesville area or from the Reading area to their factory, which is in the Morgantown area. And so this is an issue of affordable housing and transportation all at one time.
And that kind of takes two more categories out, but you had some questions around SEPTA specifically, removing some routes and transportation, and also just
I'm harassing them. I know what you're talking about, whoever asked this question, and I'm harassing them. Collectively, a lot of us are harassing.
And also encouraging electric vehicles, which you just had mentioned.
So, importantly, I drive an electric vehicle, and I appreciate, Peter, this is a plug for you guys, that you guys have places where I can plug in. We need more. When I drive around our community, I mentioned Ackland, I mentioned Reading, I mentioned Southern Chester County. We don't have enough charging stations in our area. On a good day, when I'm driving around our community, I will run out of steam. And so if we're going to encourage people to purchase these electric vehicles, the Inflation Reduction Act also encourages us to put the infrastructure in to be able to do that. Importantly also, we have need to make sure that we're permitting. Permitting reform is something that I would ask you all, whether you're on the left or the right of the energy issue and conversation. I need you guys to advocate for better permitting, faster permitting at a federal level as well as at a state level, because many of the things we hope to do to help make us less energy dependent and make us more clean and green cannot happen without more rapid permitting.
Thank you. We have some questions regarding farm subsidies, the reauthorization of the farm bill, and also some concerns that a farm perhaps has not been able to receive any funding.
Yeah, one of the things I blew through because we were running so long on time was the farm bill. This is for those of you guys who maybe are not in agriculture, it's a big deal, even if you're not, because the farm bill comes up for reauthorization every 5 years, and this is the year that it's supposed to come up for reauthorization. If you eat, you care about whether the farm bill, gets reauthorized. Right now, it's one of those things that's kind of in the graveyard, and I'm not certain that we're going to be able to pull it off. We've kind of extended it through the continuing resolution through the end of the year, through the election, basically, and that's not acceptable. That's not a path for success. So I hope that we'll be able to get our legs back under us for the farm bill. But for those of you guys who not only don't eat, but also all the rest of us who worry about children and their school lunches and those kinds of things, the farm bill is where all of that stuff happens too. So right now it's sort of in a holding pattern. I'm hoping it's one of the things that we can find our way to success on.
Can you give us some examples of the things you're working on in the Problem Solvers Caucus?
Yeah. So an example would be actually the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, the IIJA. That actually came to life in the Problem Solvers Caucus. And backing all the way up, the Problem Solvers Caucus is another one of these Noah's Ark groups. It's about, I think it's 40-something members now, equally divided between Democrats and Republicans. And then we have subgroups. And so one of the subgroups was a working group on infrastructure. They put together this proposal of how we would create what was to become the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. They floated it over to the Senate, and as the Senate does, the Senate decided to claim credit for it. And then it was their idea. And as the Senate then does, they shared it with the President, who also decided to claim credit for it. And then it came back to the House, where many of us decided, strangely enough, not to vote for the very thing that we created. And that's because of party politics, right? So the bipartisan problem-solving caucus created a piece of legislation that many of the Republican members didn't vote for because of pressure. And I'm the first to also tell you that pressure exists on both sides of the aisle. But this is what you're kind of up against when you're in Washington. You're trying to do the right thing for the people, and you're also managing all the other kinds of things that are going on.
Thank you. We had some questions
So
specifically.
wait, can I go back on
Oh,
that?
of course.
We also are working on the border, we're also working on healthcare, we're also working on family leave. Like, there are working groups on all of these different area issues.
We had some questions regarding the improving of domestic manufacturing.
So important to look at the CHIPS and Science Act. This is actually a very big deal. There's going to be some kinks that need to be worked out in its execution. I think those kinks are going to be worked out through Commerce and a variety of other implementers of it. But this is a piece of legislation that's attempting to bring back manufacturing writ large into the country through lots of huge incentives for mostly big companies, to be really honest, but hopefully with lots of trickle down to some of those smaller second and third tier suppliers, of whom there are many in Chester and Berks County. And we hope that we'll be able to bring electric vehicle, battery manufacturing, chip manufacturing, you name it, those kinds of technologies to the country as a result. And I think we're seeing some good first results, not without some hiccups, which I'm certain that you guys are reading about as well.
And then I think the final question is in regards to concerns over civil rights and voting rights, and also the 2024 election and violence, potential violence.
I am worried too. Yesterday at the Martin Luther King Jr. March, we were reenacting the march in Selma at the Pettus Bridge, and it was really cool and very impactful. If you have a chance, and if they do it next year, I would encourage you to participate. It was the first time they did this. But they had a march, was 4 blocks long, and each block marked each one of the days of the march, where they spent the night and kind of what the living conditions were. And then at the end, we met up at church, and we ended up having different people playing the role and part of different people in history that weren't Martin Luther King, Jr. And they told us all about their different parts in history. It was super inspirational, but basically the bottom line was that was all in service of voting rights and getting the right to vote. And we are really in danger at this point in time of losing a lot of the work that we've done so much on in the area of voting rights. And we really, as a collective community, need to value and prize the right to vote. And I will say this, whoever you vote for, as much as it pains me to say that, I support your right to vote for whomever you vote for. It's really important that we support each other in voting, and that we recognize that we as people who are supporting each other in voting are supporting the very people who are sitting at the polls helping us. They are us. That's who's there. And it's very important to verify them and humanize them. We are sitting in one of the most important parts of the map in 2024. The decision on the president, the decision on the Senate, the decision on the House of Representatives will go right through Chester and Berks County. So whatever you do, whomever you vote for, however you work in the next 10 or 11 months on this, please recognize that it matters what we do here. We're going to be like, the spotlight is on us. And so please make sure you do your homework and you research, and that you think about these issues, and that you trust me when I tell you that my life was in danger on January 6th. Trust me, those kinds of things. Ask first, first sources about these kinds of things.
Thank you so much. Steve, one final one in here. It was an important personal one, but can seniors in high school intern with you, and how can young people continue to be involved and engaged?
I think the answer is they have to be going to college to be able, they have to be 18, I think is the line. And the reason why, for those of you guys who are just chomping at the bit wanting to volunteer, is there's a lot of sensitive and personal information that you're asked to manage when you're managing somebody's IRS situation or whatever. But also, just as importantly, this is hard work. you will probably appreciate that there are a lot of really unhappy people who are calling our offices, and we want to make sure that young people are not exposed to those kinds of experiences. So, 18.
And what can young people do to be engaged in their community?
You can be engaged in campaigns. That doesn't have an age restriction, and there's plenty to do there. You can be engaged in helping people register to vote. You can be engaged in helping your fellow students understand, the importance of this, and in speaking to adults who are of age about the importance of this time and the importance of your issues, whatever your issues are. And I very much appreciate that there are so many young people who are so much more engaged than I ever was. As you can hear from my background, this was not necessarily in the cards for me to serve in this way, but I really appreciate that there's so many young people who are already energized in this way to be helpful. So I think that without further ado, we will move on to the concluding final remarks, and thank you for hanging in there with me for the last couple minutes of this. My district director told me to make sure that I went slow, because I was leaving you with this final message. Thank you very much for moderating this. Thank you very much for coming and joining us tonight, and for being incredibly patient and civil and decent, and for leading with the servant heart that I know we all have. We work really hard as a team to be very accessible to you. Last year, we were able to discuss the outcomes of the 117th Congress and all of the generational investments that the 117th Congress made. This year, we talked a little bit about some of those as they trickle over to us from the federal government to the state government. They were the PACT Act. They were the Infrastructure Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the CHIPS Act, and so many other more pieces of legislation that happened in 117. However, we were also able to discuss today that there's a ton of work still to be doing, and that we have to do better. And we need to do so. I hope you got out of this bipartisanly and collaboratively by being civil and decent to each other. We can't sit here and talk about how badly our neighbors are behaving, how badly our athletes are behaving, or people on social media are behaving, if we allow our elected leaders to behave badly. It's really, really important, because that weakens us. It weakens us not only here in this country, but you can bet that she is watching, and Putin is watching, and everybody else who wants to do us harm is watching as well. And you can bet that from beyond, our founding fathers and framers of the Constitution are watching us as well. Now, with something positive, as you may know, we're heading into our 250th birthday. America 250 is the nationwide commemoration of our 250th birthday in 2026. And there's a commission that's been established and it's being headed by President Obama to make sure that we treat this with the dignity it deserves. So we're taking an active role in this, our offices. I'm hoping that you guys also will take an active role in our 250th birthday. You'll be hearing more and more from me on that. I wouldn't be a good educator or good literacy advocate if I didn't conclude with a final poem. And this one by Maya Angelou, and I hope I do it justice, is, "My wish for you is that you continue to be who and how you are, to astonish a mean world with your acts of kindness. Continue to allow humor to lighten the burden of your tender heart. Continue to remind the people that each other is as good as the other, and that no one is beneath nor above you. Continue to ignore no vision which comes to enlarge your range and increase your spirit. Continue to dare to love deeply and risk everything for the good thing. And by doing so, you and your work will be able to continue." With that, I say thank you and good night. Thank you so much for spending